The United Nations was founded in 1945 with the objective of stopping all future wars. 75 years later, how's that working out for you? We'll talk about it on the Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hi folks, Chuck Holton here, and it's the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. Back in 1945, it was founded on the principle of stopping future wars. Well, how's that worked out for you? We haven't really done too well at stopping future wars. But nevertheless, the United Nations is still around and continues to grow in power and influence. And their budget these days is about $3.1 billion a year. There's 193 member states and 2 observing states, and they pretty much encompass the entire world. Maybe that's part of the problem of why they have not been able to stop wars, because everybody's got to vote and people still don't like each other. They have been pretty ineffective at that. It's kind of like this. If you were to say, welfare, government-funded welfare has worked so well at dragging people out of poverty in the inner cities of America, we need to apply that principle to the whole world. That's essentially the United Nations today. If putting a gigantic bureaucracy in charge of making the world a better place were effective, then the U.S. Postal Service would be the most well-run business in the world today. But we all know that's not the case. As it turns out, bureaucracies don't do a very good job at addressing systemic problems. Actually, they tend to sort of exacerbate the problems that they try to address. One of the things that frustrates Americans is that the United Nations is funded about a quarter of their budget for many, many years was funded by the United States taxpayer. Today, it's about 22%, but that's only because they finally, through a bunch of pressure, put a cap on the most that a country could pay toward the budget of the United Nations. And so we still give about $1 billion a year to the UN. And you might say, well, there are systemic problems in the world that just can't be addressed by any other means. Well, I would beg to differ. Let's talk about that for a minute. First of all, let's take hungry people in Africa. There's so many hungry people in Africa. We've got to have an intergovernmental organization to try to address that issue. And indeed, the World Food Program feeds a whole lot of people across Africa. But one of the things that's missing when a giant bureaucracy comes in and you parachute in a bunch of bureaucrats and smart people from Yale and Harvard and London and New York to Sudan, is maybe they don't quite get all the nuances and intricacies of the needs of those people. And so they end up, it's like taking a giant sledgehammer to kill a fly. It really causes more damage than it helps. And so what you get is massive waste. We get spending that would just blow your mind. I've seen, for example, in Kenya, where the World Food Program came in and looked at these people. Oh, these poor little brown people, they need some food in here. They don't have enough food. And so they brought in shiploads of grain. Well, you know what? These people never had grain before. They were herders. So they were used to sheep. They were used to meat. And they had meat. They had milk. They had stuff from their sheep. Everybody had a job, to follow your sheep around, that sort of thing. They were poor, but bringing in shiploads of grain didn't exactly help, because about half that grain ended up getting made into beer. And now there's a massive problem with alcoholism in those far-flung, remote villages in Africa where there was never alcohol before. And so that's an unintended consequence, because these people are using a 30,000-foot view when what we need is a much lower view. And so the difference between a diplomat or bureaucrat coming in and trying to make decisions for people, and contrast that to, say, a missionary who goes and lives among those same people and gets to know them, gets to know their needs, gets to know their culture, and gets to know their language, and then he's going to have a much better sense of what these people truly need to improve their lives. And he's spending his life with those people so he can not only give them maybe some education or some awareness that they didn't have before that might change their outlook and change their work ethic and that sort of thing, but he can show them what healthy choices look like. He can show them what a functional family looks like. These are things that they probably never seen before, and learning about making good choices and learning about making healthy choices and learning about being faithful to your family and fathers staying with their wives and kids obeying their parents and that sort of thing can have a much more far-reaching effect than dropping a shipload of grain on your head. If we just talk about the overhead that the World Food Program and the United Nations has, compared to the U.S. government, they're much more efficient. The U.S. government only for about, I understand that for every dollar they take in taxes, only about 60 cents gets out the door to a program. So that means that they've got a 40% overhead. That's massive, very inefficient. On the contrary, the United Nations has about a 6% overhead. So hey, that's a lot better. But that doesn't mean that that's the way to go, because if you take a non-governmental organization, how about Operation Blessing? Their administrative costs are 1/2 of 1%. So when it comes to magnifying the power of the money being given to help people, you're going to do a lot better with that than you are with a non-governmental organization or a charity or something like that than you are with any kind of intergovernmental organization like the UN. Even though the UN is better than the US government, remember, it's US taxpayer funds being used to fund the UN. So that means that if we give them $1 billion and that represents 60 cents on the dollar, that means that, it's $1.6 billion or $1.8 billion, something like that, that the United States has to collect in taxes in order to give $1 billion to the UN in order for 94% of that to make it out to their programs. It's much less efficient. Whereas you give your money directly to a charity, that charity goes out and helps the people directly. And very often you have more than 100% of the donations actually getting to the people. What I mean is donations beget more donations. Not only that, when it comes to security, the United Nations was founded on the principle of stopping wars around the world. Well, we know that has been an abysmal failure, but we all have seen these images of the blue helmets, the UN peacekeepers around the world in places like Haiti and Lebanon and where many other places. But personally, having been to many of the places where those blue helmets are doing their peacekeeping operations, I can tell you anecdotally that I have never run into people living in a place where UN peacekeepers are working who are glad the UN peacekeepers are there. Whether it's right on the northern border of Israel or in Congo, where I met a whole group of women who had to pool their resources to hire private security to protect them from UN peacekeepers who kept raping them. Or in Haiti, where UN peacekeepers brought an epidemic of cholera to add insult to injury after the earthquake in 2010. It's just never been very effective to have UN peacekeepers there, because either they're operating on very restrictive rules of engagement, or you've got Sri Lankan soldiers functioning as UN peacekeepers, and those guys really have no idea what peace looks like. They've not come from a place where there is peace. So that's not a very good thing. So there's not a great track record, and we're not surprised at that. Now, not surprisingly, the UN opening their General Assembly this week gave a bunch of speeches congratulating themselves for how great they are. Here's one of those.
In many ways, the UN has proven to be a successful experiment. With notable exceptions, its convening power brings much of the world to the table.
But as I said, the United States is starting to figure out that maybe we're not getting our money's worth out of the United Nations. And so we pulled out of the World Health Organization recently. And here's a little bit about why we did that.
The World Health Organization was for many years considered a center of science over politics, data over bias. That is why the United States was always the single largest funder. That reputation lies in tatters today after the WHO assisted the Chinese campaign to withhold cooperation and lie to the world.
And of course, Donald Trump went and spoke to the United Nations. Here's a couple of the sound bites from what he had to say.
As we pursue this bright future, we must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. In the earliest days of the virus, China locked down travel domestically while allowing flights to leave China and infect the world. China condemned my travel ban on their country, even as they canceled domestic flights and locked citizens in their homes. The Chinese government and the World Health Organization, which is virtually controlled by China, falsely declared that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission.
And when it comes down to it, there are experts who say that the United Nations, they do some good and they have some big problems. And I want to show you both sides of that debate, not just my opinion. So here's what one of the quote unquote experts has to say about where the UN is today.
The United Nations has accomplished quite a bit during its very turbulent 75-year history. Obviously, during a lot of the Cold War, at least when it came to international peace and security, it was largely marginalized from those topics. But nevertheless, it built up a track record, particularly in UN peacekeeping, that is a very cost-effective means of trying to reduce violence around the world. And I would point to UN peacekeeping as one of the hallmarks of what the United Nations has done, not perfectly, but at least that it can be proud of. When you look at the United Nations, a lot of people tar it with quite a broad brush, but the fact is that many of its agencies are indispensable. And humanitarian assistance is one of those areas where the UN on a daily basis provides life-saving assistance to about 80 million people around the world who are either refugees or internally displaced. And so those sorts of things it does very well at. It has a much more mixed record when it comes to human rights promotion, which is another one of its the pillars of its functioning. And you see this in the work of the Human Rights Council. The United Nations, like any multilateral institution, doesn't sort of spring into action in any crisis. It has to be mobilized by its member states. And of course, when those member states, especially the major member states' interests collide, you have to have realistic expectations about what the UN can possibly accomplish. You've seen this in the breakdown of a lot of Security Council negotiations and resolutions. Whenever you have a situation where one of the permanent members, which has a veto, of course, feels like it has a stake in the issue. So over Syria, for instance, total inaction with respect to the Security Council.
All right, folks, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching The Hot Zone, and happy birthday to the United Nations. May you look internally a little bit and maybe get up off your high horse and do a little more to help people where they really need it without creating dependencies. And maybe we could all do that. One of the ways we do that is by supporting The Hot Zone, because as you know, with today's technology, when I go someplace and we meet somebody who's really in a bad way, having one of the worst days of their lives, I can interview them and show them to you, and then you can reach through the internet and actually touch that person's life yourself directly. 100% of what you give goes right to that person, and you know where it went, and you get to follow up with them just like we did today. I interviewed a Venezuelan soldier named Darwin Balaguer when I was in Cucuta, Colombia, back at the beginning of last year. And just today, our podcast supporters sent him enough money to support his family for 3 or 4 months down there. And he's got an amazing story that I hope to be able to tell the rest of very soon. So thanks for being a part of it. You can go to patreon.com/hotzone to contribute and subscribe to the podcast. And I hope you will, because again, the more you help, the more people we're able to help, and you get to see who you help directly. So we'll see you next time. Have a good weekend.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.